Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the second series of the Indonesia-Australia Virtual Campus-to-Campus Outreach, hosted by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia in collaboration with the Australian Embassy here in Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm Esther Tamara, an associate at FPCI's Research and Analysis Department, and I will be your moderator for the day. I am pleased to welcome our more than 1,200 registrants who are watching this live on our YouTube channel. They come from 40 countries, from Indonesia, Australia, even Ethiopia, Ecuador, Belgium, and Bulgaria. Once again, welcome. This virtual outreach series is held with the hope that it may increase people-to-people connection between Indonesia and Australia through the establishment of a youth strategic dialogue platform whereby the youth of two countries can come and discuss an issue of their interest. In the past, we have held a similar discussion where we discussed the role of youth in shaping a better post-pandemic society. Right now, joining me in the Zoom room are students from Universitas Padjadjaran, representing Indonesia, and students from University of Melbourne, representing Australia. I'd also like to welcome our friends from the ASEAN-Australia Strategic Youth Partnership, from the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association, as well as from the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesia Studies. Okay, it is now my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Gary Quinlan, the Australian Ambassador to Indonesia, to open this with his speech. Excellency, please.
Selamat siang to all our Indonesian colleagues, and selamat sore to our Australian colleagues. We're getting some backplay here, I think, so can you hear me clearly? Because I'm getting, yeah, that's fine, thank you. Obviously, look, it's great as always to be partnering again with Pak Dino Jalal and his brilliant team at FPCI, where we have a long history with each other, and we're going to continue as very close partners into the future. Of course, being able to be present, former Indonesian Foreign Minister Pak Marty Natalegawa is a very distinctive privilege. And I want to acknowledge what a tremendous foreign minister he was. And of course, a great postgraduate alumnus of the Australian National University. And we've known each other for quite a while, including in New York many years ago, when we were both ambassadors to the UN. 1,200 or over 1,200 people, that speaks for itself. That's a remarkable figure. And one aspect of COVID-19, I think that I've certainly noticed, is this huge growth in engagement of this kind between think tanks, interest groups, and community groups, because of the need to do it, but because there's a very genuine appetite. It's responding to an appetite people feel about wanting to know what is going on and wanting to see what does that mean for each of us and for each of our communities. And new partners have been found in that process as we expand our horizon. Two great universities have got students participating campus to campus. Universitas Padjadjaran, of course, of Bandung, very distinctive history, dating back, among other things, to the great Asia-Africa 1955 conference, leading to the non-aligned movement, strong Indonesian leadership, massive decisive influence on foreign policy for decades, and the University of Melbourne, Australia's second oldest university, which just prior to COVID adopted a new 5-year plan of extra engagement in Indonesia. We now need to make sure that that initial momentum is regained and re-energized in the future. Look, the star of this, of course, is Pak Marty, so I really shouldn't say very much. Perhaps I could just make a couple of quick points about the context in which the discussions that he is going to lead us through and speak about today take place. We all know that COVID-19 has been globally the most disruptive event since World War II. But what I want to sort of remind ourselves of is the world was already pre-COVID going through the most disruptive era that we've been through, not only in decades, that in some ways, for hundreds of years, as the geostrategic center of gravity in the world moved from the transatlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And the geoeconomic phenomenon that has also developed in parallel with that has emerged as a new factor, had emerged already, and is something we're dealing with. Cyber, which is new cyber developments happening so quickly and so radically that they have altered the balance of power between countries as well as within countries. Disinformation, which is now such a deliberate and significant factor in our strategic ecosystem, both as a deliberate strategic weapon and then through just, the misuse of social media and everything else, underlining community resilience and undermining the difference between truth and lies. And then, of course, profound ecological change and the most extraordinary technological change, the fastest pace of technological change in human history. All of this was happening anyway, massive disruption. Then we get the pandemic, which has accelerated all those trends. What is the outcome of all of that? Well, the outcome is what we'll be discussing today. That is, there's a greater need for countries to stand up proactively to shape those developments and their own immediate neighbourhood and the global neighbourhood. And diplomacy, of course, is such a strategic tool in order to do that. If anything, COVID-19 has shown us what happens when you have a political leadership in the world globally. The G20 failed, the G7 failed, the UN Security Council failed. The UN agencies, WHO, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, the Population Fund, they all stood up and did what they needed to do, and it's been essential. But the political leadership failed. And so the onus has fallen back on middle countries, middle powers like Indonesia and Australia, to make sure that we together were doing as much as we could and reaching out so that we didn't lose the ability to shape what is that emerging crisis. I should stop there. I will say that my own country's experience, just in terms of engagement, our Prime Minister has, over the last 9 or 10 months, had something like 7 or 8 times more engagements virtually with world leaders and a couple of visits than previously, and sometimes new groups of leaders, all because there was a need to exchange information about public health, economics and strategic issues. Our foreign ministers likewise. I noticed this week the Australian Prime Minister had the first of the new series of annual special summits with the leaders of Malaysia. And they launched a new comprehensive strategic partnership. This was 2 days ago. Now, Australia has that, of course, already with Indonesia. But the two leaders were able to have the summit on Monday, I think it was, and adopt the new comprehensive strategic partnership and a whole series of new bilateral improvements between each other. And the same thing we did with India a few months ago. And these are significant step-ups in relations which were able to be instrumentalized through virtual diplomacy. So it can be done. I will leave it there. I will conclude maybe by saying Australia and Indonesia have been very intimately engaged with each other during the pandemic. Our leaders speak to each other frequently. It's not only the President, Prime Minister, it's been our foreign ministers, our defence ministers, our heads of defence forces, our security ministers, our information ministers, our economic ministers. And we put extra effort into ensuring that engagement happened to maintain momentum that we already had, but actually to make a few new achievements. We've actually established some new operational areas of cooperation in trade and investment, and that will be a great thing for the future. But we had to put huge effort into it. And okay, meetings are not organic face-to-face. You miss some of that. But paradoxically, as I said, we've actually seen more frequent engagement among key leaders like your president and the Indonesian president, Australian Prime Minister, in response, because we decided to be active and just overcome the obstacles and do what was needed. Sorry, I have spoken too long, so please forgive me, and I should really leave it to the stars. And Patino, I think you're going to speak as well, so please.
Thank you, Ambassador Quinlan. Next, Patino, if you'd like to say your brief hellos.
Yeah, hi everybody. Obviously I don't have a big speech. I'm just the pretty face in this lineup. And I was also surprised when I heard there's 1,200 people joining, and I said, hey, I didn't know I was that popular. And my staff humbled me by saying, no, they didn't tune in for you. They tuned in for Pak Marty, right? So that was a humbling moment. But really, this has been one of FPCI's good programs, one of my favorite programs, which is to connect students from both sides, from both countries, and to get them to converse and to be supervised by a very special mentor. Marty is a living legend. I'm not saying this because he's here, but even when he just joined the foreign ministry some 30 years ago, people were speaking about him. There was this young talent that everybody knew was going to go far. And of course, we all knew that he became foreign minister. Before that, he was ambassador to the UN and our ambassador to London. And he remains to this day one of the best foreign policy minds in Indonesia, and very widely respected. And it may be a surprise to you that Indonesia, a country of 270 million people, we have very, very few foreign policy wonks. People who understand foreign policy, people who understand the policy side rather than the theory side of it, and people who know the insights and the experience and the feel of foreign policy. So I hope you take this rare advantage to listen to Marty, what he has to say, and ask him any tough questions. He used to be a spokesman, just like me, and he's very used to taking tough questions about diplomacy. And just a final point before I give the floor to Marty. I agree with Gary that things are very different now in terms of how diplomacy is run. There are more meetings, but I think really diplomacy is about human interactions. It's about pulling somebody aside and feeling his breath, looking somebody in the eye, and joking together over coffee and things like that. COVID has robbed us of that very special dimension of diplomacy. And diplomats are trying to get used to it, and also. It's tough to actually work from home. Like the foreign ministry, about 95% of people are working from home, and a lot of our diplomats are trying to get used to how to get productive and remain engaged on issues working from home, and how to do this watching Netflix instead of watching doing Zoom calls and all that. So having said that, again, I want to thank Marty. I know he has a lot of. He's a very good person and hard to and I'm very appreciative that he takes the time, Australian alumni, to speak to the students. And also thank you to Ambassador Gary for all the support and friendship he has given to FPCI. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Palino. Finally, I'm now honored to introduce our speaker for today's lecture, Dr. Martina Talagawa. During his distinguished and decorated political career, Dr. Natalegawa served as Indonesia's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2009 until 2014. He also served as the country's permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as ambassador to United Kingdom and Ireland, throughout which he consistently championed the value of Indonesian diplomacy in high-level forums. Previously, he had held the position as the Director General of ASEAN Cooperation, in which capacity he took part in an intensive effort to promote the idea of an ASEAN community. He is also the author of the book, Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within. Now he currently serves as a member, I should say, at the United Nations Secretary General High-Level Board on Mediation. He is also a distinguished fellow at Asia Society. Pak Marty, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm sure that all of us are high in anticipation to hear from Pak Marty, but first I'd like to invite us all to take a virtual photo session. So for all of our participants in the Zoom room, I kindly ask you to please open your camera so that we can take several screenshots here. And on my cue, please give your biggest smile. So I'll say 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, another one. In 1, 2, and 3. One more time, freestyle if you 1, 2, and 3. Wonderful. Okay. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping matters for our student participants here. Please make sure to open your camera, but keep your audio muted all throughout the lecture. You will have the opportunity to ask Dr. Natalegawa questions during the Q&A session later.
Can you say it again?
Yeah, so before we get started, I would just like to remind participants to keep their camera open and keep their audio muted. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions later in the Q&A session. Turn over the microphone to Dr. Natalegawa to start his lecture.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed. There is a little bit of echo, Bu Esther. Let me try. Is my audio fine, Padino? Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation, and I'm especially pleased that this morning, afternoon Australia's time, that I can be in the same forum platform as Ambassador Gary Quinlan as well as Ambassador Dino Patijawa, two colleagues with whom I've spent a great deal of time working together in the pursuit of our country's common interests. And I wish to associate myself with those who have spoken in favor of closer Australia-Indonesia ties, especially amongst the young of Australia and Indonesia. I've been asked this morning to share some thoughts on the issue of the future of diplomacy in COVID-19 era. In a way, as Pak Gary had just now mentioned, it is nowadays impossible to speak of any subject or any topic without being prefaced, without referencing the COVID pandemic. It's such a defining, it's such an overwhelming challenge of our time that whatever subject that you are to speak on, you must make reference, you must place in context the pandemic that we are all going through nowadays. Such that I think is quite acceptable to use the term COVID, the current COVID pandemic, as being era defining, epoch defining. We will probably speak in the future of a pre-COVID, COVID and post-COVID situations. That is how overwhelming and defining this whole experience has been. But in contrast to other era, in a way, the current pandemic is rather different. One cannot simply proclaim through beautifully crafted words, through treaties or through agreements, the end of this era. You know, I mean, one can imagine circumstances in the past, for instance, when we punctuated the end of the Cold War, certain political events, certain political moments when we say essentially one era ends and another begins. But in the case of the pandemic, this is very much a science-led, science-determined punctuation. It is not a political event. It is, above all, a health and a science-determined situation. Hence, we must be extremely humble and extremely have a manage expectation as to when we can, you know, safely declare or assume that we are moving from one juncture or one era to another. The second point that I wanted to begin by way of some introductory thoughts, in line with the recognition that the COVID pandemic has been so all-encompassing and so comprehensive in nature, one can actually dissect, or one can appreciate or identify a number of facets, a number of dimensions in relations to the COVID pandemic. The most obvious one, the most obvious and arguably, and I would contend, the most important is the public health dimensions. Day in and day out, hour by hour, minute by minute, we are reminded of the the severe consequences of the COVID pandemic, loss of lives, least of all. But one must also, when thinking about the public health consequence of the COVID, must probably be wary and informed not only of the most direct public health consequence, but the more indirect one as well. One can imagine maybe years from now, the consequence will be fully felt of treatment of preventable diseases being postponed or being deferred as a result of COVID, of the resource reallocation caused by the COVID in terms of health resources. And these developments or situation, I suspect, will have manifestations in the public health domain apart from the most direct COVID-related impact. Public health is an obvious and primary facet of the COVID. The other that's often mentioned and discussed is the economic dimension. And here I think we are constantly reminded on how the COVID pandemic has impacted on global and national economic growth, on trade disruption, causing disruption to global supply chains and pressures on fiscal and monetary conditions in various countries. But once again, I'd like to, along the line that I mentioned before on the public health dimension, more than the obvious quantifiable indices, one must be wary of the impact of the COVID on poverty alleviation, on how the COVID has impacted adversely the most vulnerable members of our society. Obviously, all of us are impacted, but some are impacted economically, socially, more than others. The other manifestation or nexus that one can highlight or at least identify is the nexus between the COVID pandemic and the environment, or climate change, as is often now simplified. What is the impact of the current situation, for instance, on the issue of waste management? One can immediately imagine and recalls certain practices that we are now, take as a common practices that will have impact on our environment, on our resources. But not least of all, I think the COVID should, I hope it must, remind us of the correlation between protection of our environment and the introduction of new diseases. One is informed, for instance, of how the destruction of fragile environment can lead to discovery or the triggering of hitherto unknown or undiscovered diseases, especially in the fields of zoonotic. So this correlation between the environment and the pandemic, I think, is an area that is well worth investing our better knowledge on. Not least of all, since we are in front of a lot of students, is the education impact. Imagine for one whole year, basically, young people all over the world have been denied, millions have been denied direct schooling. What is the impact of months and months of virtual schooling in terms of their development? And one must be reminded that access to digital facilities is not yet equal in many societies. Probably one can foresee a situation, greater digital divide being accentuated and really leading to some inequities in the future as well. The nature of work have changed. But just now highlighted how, for instance, within our foreign ministry, the work from home has impacted the way they conduct themselves. And technology, as Gary has mentioned just now, is one that we will increasingly recognize how COVID pandemic has accelerated the digitalization of our life, and at the same time, probably potentially accentuating digital divide. Not least of all, and this is a subject which I'm really keen to study myself, to study deeper. What are the governance dimension to this? The COVID pandemic, in a way, is a global phenomenon impacting all of us, but the response throughout the world have varied. Some have responded in certain ways, others in other ways. So there is a question to be raised, issue to be studied in terms of the impact or the relevance of governance on response to the pandemic. Which governments places science at the forefront? Which governments places knowledge and objective knowledge and science at the forefront as the primary driver of policy, and which chose not to? And what are the consequences if they chose not to place science at the forefront? And not least of all, and the subject of our discussion this morning, is the impact or the relevance of the COVID pandemic on interstate relations. This is obviously a constant. There is a mutually affecting and reinforcing impact. One can talk of the impact of the COVID pandemic on multilateralism, on the future of multilateralism, and earlier Ambassador Quinlan has already made references to this fact. How has the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, impacted on multilateralism? Has it strengthened multilateralism, or has it demonstrated multilateralism adrift, multilateralism in need of revival and strengthening? It has also impacted on geopolitics. We have seen over the past year how the response to COVID, including in areas that you would think is quite health dominant, we have seen the projection of geopolitical interests onto the discourse. Australia, of course, would be extremely familiar with this reality, with how Australia as a government, have chosen to take the lead in pushing for a science-based objective analysis of the origins and sources so we draw lessons learned of the COVID. And as a consequence, some countries may feel that it is a pursuit that is inimical to it, and there's been going back and forth as a result. In other words, multilateralism, geopolitics, and the COVID pandemic have interacted and impact on one another. Diplomacy is clearly a domain that is also not immune from the current experience. And this is the bit that I want to spend the rest of the allotted time given to me this morning and this afternoon. And for the sake of the current discussion and at the risk of oversimplification, I'd like to simply not quite define, but to understand diplomacy in the context that I'm saying at the moment as simply being the management of relations among countries or among states. So it's the most generic and the most general understanding of what diplomacy is, essentially how countries manage relations amongst themselves. Within that broad spectrum or broad understanding, there are certainly many ways of dissecting and many ways of approaching the subject matter. One common one that Pa Gary and Pa Dino would be extremely familiar with, one can differentiate between bilateral diplomacy, self-evidently between two countries, and multilateral diplomacies, diplomacy between a group of states. It could be regional, for instance, ASEAN. It could be global, for instance, within the UN system, United Nations and its associated bodies. It can be non-UN multilateral, for instance, the G20 that Pa Gary had mentioned. APEC is another one. The European Union is a regional example. But to distinguish between bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. One can also dissect the subject of diplomacy by way of themes, and this is actually quite a common pursuit nowadays, distinguishing between themes such as economic diplomacy, or commerce diplomacy, consular diplomacy or protection of nationals overseas, humanitarian, health issue as well has commonly been coined and used the term health diplomacy, which actually predates the current preoccupation on the pandemic. Pa Gary and Pa Dino would recall our countries were initiators of this idea of global health and foreign policy, drawing lessons learned from SARS earlier to recognize that there is a nexus, there is a link between foreign policy and diplomacy and health issues. And we, back in early 2000s, mid 2000s, we introduced that particular forum. So thematic approach is quite common nowadays. In my view, in my impression, sometimes a little bit gone too far, but I will delve into that further later. But it is not uncommon to differentiate between economic diplomacy, commerce, consular, humanitarian, even recently vaccine diplomacy, a point that the Director General of the WHO has lamented on. He has, if I'm not misquoting him, expressed some exasperation on how even on the domain or issue of vaccine, we should be treated in certain other ways. It is increasingly becoming national in its approach. And actually in some foreign ministries, the term digital diplomacy have become quite a popular one as well. And that is something that is increasingly being felt. Apart from those delineation, bilateral, multilateral, thematic, another one would be formal, informal diplomacy. Some diplomacy are formal, formal meeting, formal conferences, and the other one is the type that Pa Dino made references to earlier, the informal type. Much of our work, and Pa Gary would attest to this, in New York certainly a lot of progress or not progress were registered not in the formal meetings itself, but in the corridors, over a cup of coffee as we chat, and or dinners after the actual at the end of the day, or lunches that we have. So informal and formal is another way of dissecting diplomacy. And overarching all this, or running through all this, is the notion that diplomacy essentially is about representation, how countries represent diplomats represent their countries, and among others, negotiations. But certainly, whatever term that you use, however you dissect the issue, a central element of diplomacy must be communications, especially the notion words matter. We are wordsmiths. For diplomats, words are the key instruments, however it's delivered, whether it be nowadays through the digital form, through traditional diplomatic notes. It is through words that we convey intent, we convey our policies and comprehend and understand others' policies as well. Now, the COVID-19, the pandemic, at the risk of oversimplification, in my view, has not necessarily created new problems or new challenge and opportunities. And Gary has made references earlier of how empowering in a way the digital opportunity now we have in terms of diplomacy. But I feel that there are at least a number of ways that the pandemic, while not quite introducing new challenge opportunities, but they have accelerated certain trends or reminds us of the need to address certain issues. One dynamic, there are three, by the way. The first one, and not by order of priority, the first one I think is how the pandemic alert us of the nexus, the interrelationship between domestic and external domain. And diplomacy, in the most traditional sense, assumes a clear delineation between what are internal domains, domestic, national, and what are external. Hence, we have diplomats as emissaries, as negotiators, to communicate between, to provide the link between this internal and external domain. But surely, as Gary had mentioned before, the pandemic really reminds us of certain trends, certain almost inevitable trends that we are seeing of increasingly having issues that defy national solutions, issues that are all at the same time, local, national, regional, and global. Whether it be because of the causes, the root causes, whether it be because of the impact, the consequences, whether it be because of the solutions required impacting one another. The pandemic is the perfect illustration, is the most manifest illustration of this link between the domestic, the national, and the international. And I think this brings certain consequences for diplomacy as a profession, diplomacy as a pursuit. Certainly, it on paper, it should reinforce the importance of diplomacy, because problems that defy national solutions, problem that requires cooperative partnership, requires people who actually allow this to happen, to have communication, to negotiate and to address, identify common issues and common concerns and common interests. But it is not always as simple as that, in my view, because diplomats as a profession, as professionals, they're working not in a vacuum. They're working within a certain political environment in their own respective capitals. There are domestic expectations, there are domestic dynamics that diplomats must be mindful of and must manage first. Increasingly, there is a me first mentality in many capital, transactional in their outlook. One's gain must be at another's cost. I think this is quite a problematic situation. I mean, diplomats in their DNA, of course, we represent, we push, and we fight for our respective national interests. But at the same time, we realize, I think we should realize, that even the protection and promotion of those national interests requires international cooperation. They cannot unilaterally be forced upon. They must be earned. Interests must be protected and preserved and promoted within this international society. And hence, I feel, and I know that Padino has written quite extensively recently on this issue of domestic and international on another subject matter unrelated to the COVID. I think increasingly, I feel the professional diplomats must exercise thought leadership within their own countries. It is not good enough for diplomats to simply follow wherever the wind blows and then hope for the best. Diplomacy must be able to communicate externally and internally so that we have informed knowledge of what the conditions are that must be navigated. In saying this, I'm not saying that we must devalue or set aside our national patriotic sentiments. On the contrary, it is precisely to effectively and efficiently promote our national interests that we must be mindful and be aware of the dynamics outside our countries, dynamics within our countries, to be able to be effective in promoting those interests. I am more and more reminded, Pageri and Padino, when we were, in previous discussions, one term that is often used is the notion of human security. Isn't the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the greatest illustration of how ultimately security is human, is individual, is your own personal safety and well-being? And it is a common security. No one is safe until everyone is safe. That is the fact of life. Hence, this scramble for vaccine must be seen within that context. One can only be safe when everyone is safe. And in my view, this is one nexus or one correlation or dynamics that the pandemic is reminding us the need for diplomacy to manage, to better manage the domestic and external correlation, the reality that our world is increasingly enmeshed and that one cannot have an overly blinkered and a narrow understanding of what's going on around us. The second dynamic, I'm sorry if I take up too much time, is the nexus between issues. I did make reference at the beginning how diplomacy is increasingly and popularly dissected along themes: diplomacy, economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy, health diplomacy, digital diplomacy, consular diplomacy. Well, everyone have with environment, climate diplomacy. Whatever subset or topics now seems to be deserving a category of its own. And that is perfectly fine. It's often needed to develop attention and to develop expertise. But there is a risk that one enters into like a silo mentality, as if one is more primary over the other. One is beginning to lose the connectivity or the nexus, the links between these issues. The economists talk only and view matters only within their own prism. Likewise, those who are more into the discourse of political discussions, the geopolitics, have the same inclination. I think for diplomacy on the one hand, and people like Padino and Pak Gary and myself in the past, in my case, in the past, we quickly came to learn as new issues are being discussed as an interstate issues, we must develop expert knowledge, specialized knowledge on health issues, on trade dispute issues, for instance. These are the type of issues that are highly functional, highly technical even, that the diplomats of the present day must inform themselves, must be able to converse in the language, and even better still, to negotiate and to mediate on these highly technical issues. For sure, for certain, we need to develop new skills in this hitherto outside of traditional diplomacy domain. But at the same time, I think the diplomats, the professional diplomat, must not lose sight of the broad picture, the forests and the trees, because the professional diplomacy in the links with the outside world, they should be able to see the broad picture, how one issue really correlates with one another, so that we have a comprehensive approach, one that is synergic with one another. I think this is a challenge that diplomacy must try to address. The COVID reminds that how these issues are very much correlated, as I was saying at the beginning just now, how the COVID pandemic is a reminder, there are so many facets to it, that one must ensure that solution to one doesn't create problems or undo a solution to others. And by the way, it's not only pandemic and COVID, though the challenge that all of us, and I'm glad that there was some public polling recently conducted, I forgot by whom, the notion of climate emergency, I think is one. If pandemic COVID is now considered to be so defining and so problematic, I can't imagine how a climate change crisis will impact all of us. With the pandemic, one can seek to develop, as we have, what a fantastic achievement. Within 1 year, a process that would normally take ages, all these brilliant scientists can come up with vaccines. But how do you deal with climate change, with the air that one breathes? Surely this is an issue that is deserving of a more current, here and now management, rather than waiting until the issue becomes less surmountable. The third and final dimension is the nexus with technology. I think the pandemic and the distancing that this has caused within countries and also between countries has, as Gary just now reminded us, has been made less severe, probably more manageable, in quote, thanks to the advent of technology. Imagine how even more isolated, how even more impacted we would all be if we don't have all these wonderful tools, digital tools, to be able to connect and to communicate. It is, and in this sense, in this way, actually the pandemic, the COVID, simply, as Pak Gary had mentioned before, accelerated a trend that is already prevailing, that was already before us. Professional diplomats, traditionally being stationed in capital A or capital B, traditionally they gather information and they quickly dispatch information. But nowadays information is 24/7, can be obtained, can be informed real time to the headquarters. So what is the role of the professional diplomats being assigned in their missions abroad? If it's to do with speed, certainly I don't think you can beat this 24/7 social media and traditional media news cycle. And then it's far more expensive, information can be delivered not only quickly, but not only rapidly, but also in an extensive manner, real time. Certainly, technology have given us another valuable addition to the toolkit, certainly in the domain of public diplomacy, outreach. The Padino's Foreign Policy Community Indonesia is the clearest illustration of how one can develop a community interested in foreign policy through the digital platform. And I think this is a wonderful, wonderful tool and opportunity. And a field that is not often recognized, because sometimes one think of, when we speak of technology and diplomacy, is essentially as a communication tool, how one can have a public outreach program, public diplomacy, but actually digital technologies have also impacted mediation potential for mediation, for instance, in terms of conflict analysis, geographic information system, data analysis, in terms of communications. So there are wonderful, wonderful opportunities that digital technology offer us. But, however, I don't think we should be too, we should have a sense of context and proportion of what these new tools' impact on diplomacy is. Not to be remiss of the fact that diplomacy is a profession centuries old, predates the modern state-nation system. And during that course of that several eras and epochs, there have been all kinds of new tools and technology introduced. They change how one conduct oneself, the nature of work and nature of communication, but the basic essence of diplomacy, communications, negotiations remains the same. The essence of diplomacy, as I described it before, to manage relations among states. And in the remaining part, in the concluding part of my remarks, I simply would like to alert to some of the limitations of technology. Because on the one hand, indeed, yes, technology have made the disconnect, the separation made and forced by the pandemic more manageable, because we have now tools to mitigate, tools to manage the full impact, but they are not substitutes. That is the point that I'm trying to say. Digital technology is a wonderful tools, makes our work more efficient, more opportunities abound, and more inclusive, more expansive, more real time, but they are not 100% substitutes. They cannot, for instance, substitute for the element of informality that Dino just now made reference to. I mean, I can recall many of key junctures in my 30 years or so of public service in diplomacy when informality made a difference. Being able to take stock of the other's intent, not only what the other side's wish and intent and policies are, but to be able to understand the limitation of their policy choices. I don't think one can zoom this type of difficult to describe dynamics and intent to be deciphered. Informality, confidentiality. One, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm obviously not privy to the latest information, for instance, the negotiations or the discussion, whatever is the term that's being used nowadays, on the code of conduct on the South China Sea between China and ASEAN countries. if I'm not mistaken, and I'm not privy to the latest information, throughout 2020 was put in abeyance, put aside, because there was no opportunity for direct meeting. And probably the notion or the idea of having a Zoom-based or Zoom-like negotiations may cause some concern in terms of its confidentiality. So in essence, therefore, yes, it's wonderful. Digital technology allowed us to make things not worse. It enabled some kind of communications to take place, but they are not full substitutes. Hence, it is all our hope that one day, one can return to a greater sense of normality, where more direct face-to-face meeting can take place, diplomacy can take place. No doubt that we have increasing connectivity. The young among our participants can remind people like me who are technological laggards and dinosaur in a way. What are the latest platforms that you normally connect? There is certainly greater connectivity, but the question is, are we more connected? The wherewithal is there. We have all kind of wonderful technologies. I'm still in the days of sending letters with stamps attached to them, but are we better connected? If you were to pose that question, I'm not so sure. Better connected in the sense of do we understand one another better? Has technology made us better in understanding one another? Connectivity, more growing connectivity doesn't mean that we are necessarily more connected. We certainly have more information than before. 24/7, never-ending news cycle. But at the same time, I wonder whether we are in a state of paradox of information. We have plenty of information, but we can be more selective in choosing the type of information that we prefer. In the old days, Pa Gary and Pa Dino, I don't wish to speak the old days as if there is a golden era, but the reality is, in the old days, including when I was delivering newspaper, Pa Gary in Canberra, we have hard copy papers. You have your 25-page papers or 12-page. You read from the beginning to the end. You have a sense of context. How important is this news in the scheme of things in terms of column space? But nowadays, people can choose which kind of information they would like to be reminded at the beginning of their day. Even the choice is made for them nowadays, because you have all these algorithms. I don't even know, I can't use this technology speak. All kind of technology that decides for you based on your previous searches what interests you, what kind of views correlate with your views. So do we still have a public space? Do we still have a public square? Or do we have our own little comfort zone, well informed in our own preferences and prejudices? More information, but not necessarily more informed. More information, but not necessarily more open-minded. These are the type of things that I wanted to mention in terms of technology and diplomacy that the COVID pandemic remind us. Most definitely, we should be thankful. We should be appreciative of the advent of how technology have enabled us to absorb, to mitigate the worst effects of the pandemic in terms of communication. However, it is not an absolute panacea. It is only one box in the toolkits that diplomats have, that ultimately, it must be in complementarity to complement or to supplement the more traditional methodologies. I shall conclude, if I may, by thanking Pak Gary, Pak Dino, and all involved in all your wonderful work in promoting Australia-Indonesia relations. This, to me, personally, I think if there is a bilateral relationship that is of critical importance to both countries, to Australia and to Indonesia, it is this relationship, Australia-Indonesia relationship, Indonesia-Australia relationships. And thanks to people like Pak Dino and Pak Gary, who have been instrumental in building bridges and promoting connectivities. We are now in a good state, in a good stead in our bilateral relationships. And I am hopeful and confident that amongst the participants of this webinar, they will be driven to further reinforce and strengthen our relationships. Most of all, I'd like to encourage our Indonesian listeners or participants to learn of Australia better. I may be wrong, Pak Dubes, Pak Gary, and Pak Dino. I sometimes get the impression, it is an impression, I hope I'm wrong, that there are quite a solid constituencies and communities of Indonesia interest, Indonesia, friends of Indonesia, or whatever is the term that's being used, academics on Indonesia in Australia. And I wish in Indonesia, there is an reciprocal, an equivalent interest, not of Indonesia and Australia, but Australia on its own merit. What makes Australia tick, to understand it better. And I think this is such a well worth pursuit, to understand Australia better, aside from understanding our own country, obviously, and therefore to see opportunities between our two countries. But thank you, Pak Dino, Pak Gary, and colleagues for giving me the opportunity. And I'm so sorry to take up far more time than I had planned. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You did not take more time than was allocated, so thank you so much. Before we move on to the question and answer session with the students, I'd like to ask some question that has been given to us on the YouTube chat room. One is given from Jonathan from University of Indonesia, and if I may rephrase, his question was, will this be, the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the era that in the future, if we look back, we cite again, and will set the tone of Indonesia's diplomacy or other countries' diplomacy in the way that they conduct foreign affairs in the future?
Well, I did suggest at the beginning that it would not be unusual for us, looking back, to define this as being an era. The COVID has been so impactful, so all-encompassing, so dominating all our lives that it is not unusual if we were to see it as being an era, an epoch. But the point that I was trying to say at the beginning is that unlike previous type of delineation, this is a delineation that should humble us as humanity, because it is not a human determined delineation. It will be nature's determined, health determined, when one era begins and another ends and another begins. In terms of diplomacy, foreign policy, I am, it will be for posterity to reflect, but I am pretty sure, I'm quite certain that the pandemic is taking up a great deal of the resources and the efforts on diplomacy by many countries, not only Indonesia, but also Australia. But at the same time, this is where I thought, the point being of issues being interrelated. At the same time, as we deal with COVID as we must, as a priority issue, other issues remain to be handled, to be managed, to be promoted. Climate change is one that I mentioned before. Political security issues, economic issues. Hence, one do not have the luxury of switching everything else off and then just deal with one issue, but we have a number of issues on our plate, all impacting one another, and therefore diplomacy must be comprehensive in their outlook. Hence, my hesitation to sort of add a qualification to whatever diplomacy, economic diplomacy, health diplomacy, COVID diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy. It suggests as if we can have a single focus. This is the only thing, and the rest of the world, the rest of the other issues will stand by and be on holding stations. It's not. Other issues continue to develop, and the diplomats, the professional diplomat, must have an overarching view. I'm not saying that the pandemic is important, but it is must be placed in wider context. Thank you.
Thank you. So in that context, then, would you say that virtual diplomacy or the use of technology as part of diplomatic negotiations or meetings is here to stay, even though, say, in the future and hopefully soon, the pandemic is declared to have ended?
Well, I think so. I mean, nowadays, there is a bit of an echo. Yeah. Nowadays, the digital technology has become very much part of the toolkit for diplomacy, and I can't imagine a situation where we will, fully 100%, if ever, revert back to more direct face-to-face. And I think, on the whole, the scorecard, digital technology impact is empowering. It provides new opportunities. As I mentioned before, public outreach, Pageri has mentioned before, public outreach, more inclusive, et cetera, and even in mediation field, which is not a subject matter that is not often looked at, as if, most of the focus on impact of technology has been on public outreach, but actually on negotiation and mediation, it can also have an impact. But the point that I wanted to say is that it is not all or nothing. It is not as if we go back to pens and pencil and papers or technology. It is a menu of choices. But in my view, at the very least, there must be a principle of do no harm, in the sense that technology is wonderful, digital technology is wonderful, it's great, it's empowering, it's opening up new possibilities. But at the same time, let's first and foremost make sure it doesn't do any harm. And here, for instance, in conflict resolution issue, one can reflect whether domains or platforms such as social media, your Facebooks and the like, in addressing or managing conflict situations, have they tended to exacerbate conflict? Have they tended to accentuate misperceptions? Or have they been instruments that bring countries together? I can think of many issues, examples of the former, whereby, especially when images and videos and of another event is being misrepresented as having taken place in another place. So I think the technology is only a means, it's only tools, they're only instruments. It requires thoughtful application vis-a-vis diplomacy for them to be positive instruments. Thank you.
Oh. Okay, thank you, sir, for your answer. Now, I'd like to encourage the student participants to ask questions or share your thoughts. You can use the raise your hand feature, and then I will call on you to deliver your question. One second, please. There's been a technical error from our. Okay, so we have one question from Tristan Johnson. If you can please state your name, your institutional affiliation, and ask one question.
Terima kasih, Pak. It was a really interesting discussion with very laser-focused pertinence, I would say. I'm from Achichis. I'm doing the law professional practicum. And otherwise, I study at Monash University. My question is, what are your views on the possibility of Indonesia renegotiating its border with Australia? Obviously, with the deal that was struck with East Timor in 2018 as to what their border would be with Australia, there are questions now open as to how Australia and Indonesia will manage an otherwise unorthodox border between the two countries.
Well, yeah, is that it? Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. And obviously, I'm really looking at Pak Gary now. Obviously, this is an issue that I have not been privy to in recent years. Because whenever matters to do with border are concerned, it is a highly technical and at the same time highly politicized and often case emotion-ridden issue as well. So whatever I'm about to say will be caveat, will be footnoted with the fact that I am very much not privy to the latest development. The only point, if I may, that I'd like to make is that I think even from the very beginning, ever since Timor-Leste separation from Indonesia, all three of us, Indonesia, what became known as Timor-Leste, and Australia, through sheer geography, through sheer geographic proximity, we recognize that there will come a time when the three of us must synergize and must manage our border, the convergences in our maritime border at the very least. And you know, Indonesia has its own process with Timor-Leste. I know that there's been some pending issues on the land border, and as a consequence, probably as well in the maritime domain. And of course, as you have correctly alluded to just now, Timor-Leste and Australia have been having a series of negotiations between them on their maritime boundary. When all is done, and of course in the past, Indonesia and Australia would have already also concluded its own maritime border delineation agreements, including the issue of traditional fishing practices, for instance. But when all these sets of bilaterals are done, I think there will need to come a time when the three sides need to sit together and to see how all this correlate. And thankfully, at least I can only speak of the past, and Pak Gary will need to correct me. At the very least, at least in the past, we used to have a trilateral Indonesia-Timor-Leste meetings at the foreign ministers level, including at the UN sideline of the UN General Assembly, and even at the head of state level, whereby we informally inform one another the sets of bilateral negotiations that are taking place, so that we are not starting from scratch once the time comes for the three of us to think as a three, three countries. But my sense is that most and foremost, what is needed is the political common understanding that there is an issue as to be managed as a collective three countries. And once that is recognized, then the experts need to look at where the borders dissect or approximate to one another. But it is a political and a legal issue, a complex one. And as I said before at the beginning, I'm not privy to the latest development, but I'm hopeful Pak Gary can inform us as well, whether now or later where we are on this issue. Thank you.
Look, it's Gary here. I think what Pak Marty has said sort of actually is the situation. Indonesia and East Timor-Leste currently have begun the preliminary stages of settling their own maritime boundaries. And the treaty which Australia and Timor-Leste, I was the chief negotiator for Australia, concluded in 2018. That will, once Indonesia and Timor settle their maritime domain, we will automatically reflect that with any adjustments to the 2018 treaty. But then there are other issues that may need to be looked at if that is the case. It's as Pak Marty has said.
I guess Pak Gary, I mean, besides the issue of delineation, there must be a host of issues that common issues, like for example, issues to do with environmental issues of environment, etc. That we can all have a chat over to help manage, right? I mean, because when border by definition, I mean, they're political border, a legal political border, but there are issues, environment, for instance, that transcend these borders, and I assume that they will be discussed.
No, exactly, and there are some discussions in that context, but we need to do more, and of course, particularly in relation to issues like plastic waste.
Yes.
I mean, in particular, that really is urgent. Plus, all the whole pollution strategies generally. So, yes, you're right.
Yes, that's great. That's great. Thank you very much, Pak Gary. I'm glad that you are here to inform us. Right. Thank you.
Okay, now we have a next question from Richard Humphreys.
Yes, terima kasih banyak, Pak Marty, for your insightful presentation. I'm Richard Humphreys I'm doing the Chichest internship at the moment, and I'm studying at Murdoch University in Perth. My question is about the trade relations between Australia and Indonesia. Very recently we've had the Chapter agreement, which has got great potential for the Australian and Indonesia trading. Assuming that is very successful and our trade increases and goes very well, my question is about how China could react to this, as China is Indonesia's biggest trade partner. And in recent times, Australia and China relationship has struggled a bit. We've in the media noted that China's become a bit more aggressive. And Indonesia has been quite neutral in the China and America struggle. If Australian and Indonesian trade does go very well, do you think China could react to that negatively and try and use their size and strength to kind of maybe bully Indonesia into not trading with us as much?
Well, thank you very much. First and foremost, I think all involved must be congratulated for achieving the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, Indonesia-Australia, Indonesia-Australia. What an important document that is, years in making. The comprehensive nature of the agreement must be underscored. It is not a simple only trade issues, but it defines our economic interaction in a comprehensive manner, including the partnership emphasis is extremely important. Partnership reminds that this is a mutually beneficial and mutually respectful agreement, and mindful and aware of one another's own internal challenges and opportunities. But all in all, CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership between Indonesia and Australia, provides yet another instrument or platform through which Indonesia and Australia can really deepen and widen their relationship, and especially in the economic domain. I'm not privy again to the latest numbers, but whenever in the past I look at Indonesia and Australia's numbers in terms of trade, for instance, in terms of investment, they are not insignificant, but at the same time, it reminds as well of the opportunities that are still open for even more enhanced trade relationship. But CEPA provides that opportunity, and let's make sure that all parties involved can implement and take advantage of this new wonderful agreement. But your basic question, essentially, without directly commenting to your specific question, but it reminds basically that this Indonesia-Australia agreement is not taking place in a vacuum. It's not only with Indonesia-Australia, but then Australia has its own dynamics with China. Indonesia has its own dynamics with China, and how we correlate and how we converge these realities. I do recall, if I'm not mistaken, again, I stand to be corrected, not only a few years ago, Indonesia, Australia, and China strike a free trade agreement. And at the time, I remember there was a lot of optimism being expressed on how this will offer huge potential opportunity for instance, Australia's agriculture, etc., etc. But we are where we are now, as I said before, because of the convergence of geopolitics and geoeconomics. It is what it is. This is how the situation is. But I think our focus should be how we can develop a win-win, not mercantilist outlook. That, to your point, to your question, we must encourage the perspective that for China, seeing Indonesia and Australia's trade and economic interaction blossom is not at their expense. It is not. We should not go back to like beggar thy neighbor situation of the interwar period in Europe during the 30s. But you see this as being complementary. What is good for Australia's economy, a thriving Australia's economy, a thriving Indonesia, bilateral Indonesia-Australia economy must be seen to be offering opportunities to China as well. And there are complementarities. Hence, the strategic importance, not just economic importance, of agreements such as the recently concluded, you may be aware, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. RCEP was concluded last year, 2020, was introduced all the way back in 2011 by Indonesia, initiated it within ASEAN. Why were we doing it? Because we wanted to be sure that we don't end up in a region made up of simply hub and spokes, ASEAN having free trade agreement with Australia and New Zealand, ASEAN with China, ASEAN with India, ASEAN with Japan, with Korea. But we must connect the outer dots. We must promote, thankfully with China and Australia, you have taken your own initiative, you have your own bilateral agreement. But think about it, between China, Korea, and Japan, three huge economies in our region, there isn't any comprehensive economic agreement or free trade agreement between them. It takes RCEP, the ASEAN-led process, to connect the three of them. So I think having this common tent, a wider tent, whether it be through RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or through the idea of the APEX, free and something free trade for the Pacific. I think the main point is that we must promote the idea that trade actually promotes prosperity and enhances well-being and economic well-being, and we must move away from the use of economic instruments, sanctions for political end. I think, and I must say, Pageri, as a happily retired person watching the news, television, I have to say I have a great deal of sympathy with Australia's predicament at the moment vis-a-vis China. The way the economic tools are being exerted or being applied for probably for reasons other than economic or trade. And I hope and I gather Australia will take action through the WTO process, if I'm not mistaken. And I hope this kind of tools and modalities will be taken advantage of. Strong caveat here, I'm speaking I'm only a retired individual person. My views doesn't represent anyone, but apart from my not infallible self. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. I'd like to also encourage our student participants from Indonesia to raise a question or share your thoughts. But next, I'll give the floor to Mateha Vasi. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Hello, Pak Marty. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it was excellent. And so I'm currently a student for Archichis. I'm from Western Sydney University, and I've got a keen interest in the area of geopolitics, international studies. It's also funny because I'm giving a later geopolitical presentation about Indonesia later today. So my question is specifically on the South China Sea. From what I'm looking at, the situation is deteriorating between the Chinese-American relationship in the region. It was actually just yesterday that China passed a new Coast Guard law that made the Chinese Coast Guard able to fire on vessels in disputed waters in that region. And so my question for you is, how should Indonesia and Australia secure their own national prosperity and national security, given the heightened tensions between the United States and China?
Well, thank you very much. If I'm not mistaken, in hearing just now, you are a teacher, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm a student.
A student, yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, South China Sea and the most recent development that you had mentioned before. At the risk of oversimplification, the reality is long recognized reality ever since, or long recognized, decades long, is that we have in the South China Sea disputes among countries. However, China pretend or chooses to describe as if their 9-dash line is how it is. The reality is, even the fact that they had joined, China is part of ASEAN's Declaration of Conduct on the South China Sea of 2002. China is engaged with ASEAN on the Code of Conduct discussion at the moment. So I think the political point that must be made and recognized, reinforced, and constantly reminded is that the situation in the South China Sea is replete with jurisdictional disputes, maritime boundary disputes, and therefore it is only through diplomacy, through negotiations and mediation, perhaps, that this situation can be managed. We must not allow the idea of might is right to become the norm in the South China Sea. And I believe that ultimately, I think China itself is not inclined in that way. China too, I believe, as evident in its engagement with ASEAN over the many years since 2002 through the DOC and COC now. China itself has preference to peaceful resolution and of management of the issue. And there is already, thanks to the foresight of all previous decision makers, the roadmap exists. There is not a lacunae of process. It is a process identified all the way from 2002 till now, how ASEAN and China can manage the situation in the South China Sea, step by step, incrementally, without prejudice to one another's claims. The latest development that you highlighted to me is of concern because it raises the possibility even more of risk of miscalculation. Because I don't think, well, at least I hope I'm correct, I don't think any of the countries in the region with intent and deliberately wish to start a conflict, open conflict. I don't think any countries in this region are that foolish to, with intent and deliberately and purposefully, start a conflict. I think in a way we have some kind of a security community, the idea of a conflict, open conflict in the region to be something that we should almost at any cost set aside. After all, the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, Indo-Pacific, we have been beneficiary of the peace dividend. So I don't think there is any overt, deliberate intent to start a conflict. The real risk, in my view, is risk of miscalculation, of minor incident quickly unraveling and becoming a crisis, an action-reaction, and suddenly we have a serious situation before us. This is where I think the latest decision that you made reference to is of concern, because it does make the space for decision making a little bit more compressed. We made references to technology just now, how real time and expansive and 24/7 technology is, but ultimately decisions are made by persons, by individuals. And the more efficient technologies are, or the more, because of decisions such as the type that you refer to, the more compressed is the time for decisions to be made, the risk for miscalculation becomes bigger. You don't want to be preempted. You don't want to be to lose advantage by being slow. Speed becomes the essence, and this is where I think the true risk of decisions of that type. And by the way, it's not only China. I'm sure there are examples of other countries in the region that are quite happy to be playing on the brink, like a brinkmanship. Diplomacy's intent must be conveyed through words. That's why I said words matter. That is the instruments, the tools, the weapons, if you want to use that analogy of diplomats, are words. And surely in the 21st century, you can convey intent by words rather than by deployment of military assets. They look good back home, make everyone looks tough and all that. But the real risk, I'm not sure whether you're a student of history, but think 1914, not 1939 or whatever. So it's more First World War type of action-reaction thing. So I think it is not potentially unhelpful decision, but hopefully a neutral decision, but potentially unhelpful. But I hope it doesn't provoke another series of action-reaction by other countries. Then we will be in a bind. Thank you.
Thank you for your elaborate answer, sir. Now I would like to divert momentarily to the question that we have received on our YouTube chat box. We have one from Kiki from Paramadina University. Dear Pa Marty, as we live in this borderless era, how ready are we to face the cybersecurity issue, especially the diplomats? I'm assuming that she is referring to the increased use of technology. Sir, please.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is one area, one domain. I'm afraid that I am a real dinosaur that I mentioned before. I am the last person to speak on cyber issue, because I'm not really privy. I'm not really out there and informed. I wish to be informed, but certainly you are quite right. Cyber security, or the cyberspace, is now weaponized. It is not a neutral platform. It is not a neutral bridges. They are becoming weaponized, whether for defensive purposes, allegedly, supposedly, or even for offensive purposes, to cause disruption, to cause inconveniences, and increasingly states and countries in the world develop their own special capacities, expertise in this domain. And obviously, as I said, as I was saying, trying to say at the beginning as well, diplomats must inform themselves of the actual mapping of the actual current state of affairs, and where we are going to be ahead of us. But I think, I mean, this is not a unique situation. There are moments in the past, in many decades before, when there are certain new domains. I think here, especially of the outer space. I know it seems so far out there, but the outer space. But there was a time when leaders of the time, I don't even know when is the Outer Space Treaty was signed, Pageri and Padino, but there was a time when leaders of the time exercised leadership. They say, look, we don't want to see the outer space be weaponized, becomes yet another platform, another domain for major power competition, then East-West rivalry. And therefore, they came with an agreement how to manage, how to regulate this. On chemical weapons, people like Gareth Evans, the former foreign minister of Australia, he was at the forefront, at the forefront, pushing to regulate a domain, chemicals, that can be easily, proven in history, weaponized. And with the required collective will and leadership by states, countries were able to sort of draw like a boundary, regulate the space to make sure that this becomes a safe space, whether it be chemical weapons, the Antarctic Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, the oceans, through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is where I'm asking the question, is there a similar readiness today? I don't know. I mean, I'm now, it's like a deja vu. I'm going back to disarmament issues at the moment, friends. I mean, I used to be really into disarmament, but recently back again. And I realized, wow, there's so many, the impact of technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, these things change the way warfare, modern warfare will be fought. How do you draw the question of command responsibility when decisions are not made by a person or persons, but by artificial robotics technology, artificial intelligence? Who is to be held accountable for a series of millisecond, nanosecond decisions that led, for instance, to the death of a civilian? Autonomous vehicles. So I think when our colleague just now so kindly referred to cybersecurity, as I said before, I'm not really into that. I'm not as informed as I wish to be, but my main message is that young people now must, in my view, call your leaders to account. You said, look, there are spaces here, technology, whether it be artificial intelligence, robotics, cybersecurity. We want these technologies to be wonderful instruments to promote greater prosperity and promoting connectivity, wonderful things that we all cherish and wish. We don't want these spaces to be weaponized. But leaders will only act if the population, if the public call them to action. In the absence of any call to action, this space will be left to however one chooses to make use of it. And soon enough, we will see what ought to be what ought to be safe, secure space become space for warfare. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we have our friend from Universitas Pajajaran, Yasmin Nur Habibah, if you'd like to state your question.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Marty. Thank you for your comprehensive explanations. I'm Yasmin from Universitas Pajajaran, Indonesia. Actually, I have two questions for you. The first question is, how do you think the further development of Indo-Pacific will be after the COVID-19? Will the progress and balance change, especially regarding the centrality and also the regional competencies in the Indo-Pacific itself? And then the second question is, what do you think Indonesia must do regarding the continuation of Indonesian today, besides the big demand on the vaccine? I think those are the questions from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I missed the second question actually, Bu Esther. Perhaps you can remind me the second question.
The second question, sir, was what do you think Indonesia must do regarding the continuation of Indonesian public health recovery today, besides heeding the big demand on the vaccine?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'll take the second question first. Saya menjawab yang nomor 2 dulu dari pertanyaannya, the second question first. Obviously, it's not for me to second guess. It's not for me to second guess, mempertanyakan the steps that the Indonesian government authorities have been taking to address the COVID pandemic. I'm mindful that there have been well-intentioned efforts by many, all kind of institutions, bodies, and individuals have been tasked to deal with the issue. And most recently, I think the focus has been on the issue of a vaccine, amongst others. At the same time, a constant reminder that vaccine is not like a panacea. It's not one must continue to practice the kind of safe steps and public health steps that has been encouraged. But it is my fervent personal hope that the situation in Indonesia will alleviate, will become better, because clearly the impact on our public health has been enormously. It has been quite disquieting, especially the loss of life. To be honest, is one that we must never lose sight of, because one can talk endlessly about numbers in terms of monetary or economic consequences, but surely first and foremost the economic, the life consequences is one that is at the forefront. But the government is undertaking all kinds of steps and measures, and I don't know that they're working closely, nationally, bilaterally with countries like Australia, multilaterally within ASEAN, and we must invest our hope and confidence in the government to continue. On the first issue, Indo-Pacific, I'm glad that the question has been raised, when the idea has been raised, because we are, after all, today in a Australia-Indonesia forum. If there are any countries that have a special interest and special concern on the Indo-Pacific, must be Australia and Indonesia. We are geographically, by definition, areas that actually help bridge the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and hence, not surprisingly, while others may only recently speak of the Indo-Pacific, insofar as Indonesia and Australia are concerned, the Indo-Pacific has been a long-running concern and attention as well. Recently, as Indonesia has worked diligently and promoted the idea of the Indo-Pacific within ASEAN, and I think it is a positive development that the ASEAN now finally has an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and therefore this is a development well worth expressing appreciation for the hard work made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ibu Retno Marsudi, by the team in DEPLU and ASEAN. At the same time, as you would know, Ibu Yasmin, developments in the Indo-Pacific is not without concern. There are a number of developments that are of worry in the current COVID era. For instance, just yesterday or a couple of days ago, we saw another renewal of another border incidents between India and China. We know the South China Sea was referenced earlier as well. The developments in the Korean Peninsula is a constant worry and concern. The developments in the East China Sea involving China, Japan, and Korea is also a situation of concern. In other words, Indo-Pacific or outlook does not implement by itself. They are mere words on paper. They need to be implemented. They need to be put into effect. And the question that I'm wondering is whether, in the face of all these developments, countries like Indonesia, Australia, ASEAN, have we chosen to simply become observer to these developments, only following, only expressing concern, only expressing exasperation? Or do we have a higher ambition? Do we try to prevent these things from happening? Do we try help to manage situation when situation arises? This is to do with what are our objectives, what are our perspectives. At the moment, while we have an outlook, while we have a vision, I am hopeful this will be followed by actual concrete action. When developments occur, silence can be deafening. I constantly say just now, in diplomacy, words matter. But I should also have said that in diplomacy, silence can also speak volumes. Often case, acquiescence, silence can be interpreted as being acquiescence. This is where the risk is. So I think I'm hopeful that in line with the commitment by Indonesia and Australia on the Indo-Pacific, whenever developments in the Indo-Pacific occur, Indonesia, Australia, ASEAN, we speak up and we contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Marty. I am cognizant of our time, so I'd like to take questions in batches. Perhaps we can take the question from Dave Pereira and Clarice Campbell all together.
Hi, Dave, did you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, my name is Dave Pereira. I'm from Molokai University. I'm also an HSS student from the Development of Studies Professional Practicum. Hi, thank you terima kasih on your presentation. my question is, of course, Indonesia has a lot of international challenges, but also I just want to ask domestically as well. Indonesia is said to be, by President Jokowi, plans to make Indonesia the fourth largest economy in the world by 2045. But can it can it reach there? Sorry, can reach there when it's facing challenges such as climate change, like you said, but also like ethnic tensions, religious tensions, such as terrorism, and also you got those populist leaders such as that cleric for firebrand teacher, Mohammed Tahir, I believe.
And Clarice, if you want to go next.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Pat Marty, Pat Dino, and Pat Gary. My name is Clarice Campbell, and I'm the National President of the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association. I actually wanted to ask a slightly less serious question. You know, at the moment, a lot of students on this call are unable to travel to the other country, and so they're unable to kind of practice their diplomacy skills in the sort of traditional sense. And you all, you know, had the opportunity as young people to travel overseas, do student exchange and that sort of thing in order to kind of fine tune your skills. So basically I wanted to ask, you know, how can students now in a COVID environment practice those skills at home? Is there a role for youth organizations like AYA and PPCI and that sort of thing to help those students, and just your kind of general tips on that?
Well, thank you very much for those two questions. The first one, making reference to the hope and the plan and projection for Indonesia to achieve the status of the fourth largest economy by 2025. I mean, aside from statement by the Indonesian government itself, a number of third-party entities and organizations have made similar kind of projections in terms of indices of where different economies will be, not only Indonesia, globally, where the rank of global economies by between now, 2025, 2050, so it's constantly evolving and changing list and rank. So it is not a self-proclaimed or self-assumed ambition. It is one that many other economists or economic organizations have reference to. But at the same time, I think you are alert enough to identify a number of challenges. I think you only gave a few. There would be, I'm sure, a whole host and list, extensive list of challenges, not only in Indonesia's case, but other countries' case, how that can come in between intention, plans, and reality. And you mentioned, I guess, one of them would be non-traditional, security issues. We, as many of us, would recall the days when, in the domain of security, for instance, when Indonesia was very much afflicted by a series of terrorist attacks, the Bali bombing 2002, which took the lives of scores of Indonesians and Australians, was one such defining and never to be, should never be forgotten moment. But the point that I wanted to say is that perception of security or lack of it does impact on economic conditions. How conducive is the economy because of concern in domains or in fields other than economic domain, in this case on security issues. On climate, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because I think here and now in the 21st century, we must be smarter, shouldn't we, in trying to find a way to develop our economy that is more sustainable, that is more environmental, social and governance sensitive, ESG. How can we ensure that our economic development is build back better or building better than previous practices. And the thing that gives me optimism is that actually this is what is wished for and expected by our economic partners as well. Our friends outside who wish to invest in Indonesia, increasingly, they wish to invest in an environmentally prudent, environmentally responsible way. So here is a chance for Indonesia to achieve that rank, whatever it is, 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th, whatever it is, their numbers. But the quality of our economic development is one that is environmentally sensitive, environmentally friendly as well. And once again, it is, I think, especially for the young people, to really raise climate change environment at the forefront of our political decision makers' attention. So they know that we, meaning we care and we are concerned, and it should be made as part of the decision-making calculus. It's not like an afterthought. You do some CSR program, you build whatever you want to do, certain economic activities that are harmful to the environment, but then you make it up by having some CSR program. No, it has to be streamlined, and not streamlined, mainstream to economic decision making. But it is a good, reminder that you suggested that there are a number of conditions conducive that is important. To our last colleague, the students unable to travel. Yes, wow, this is it, right? I mean, it is. All of us feel the impact of restrictions in travel in many shape and form. You mentioned on how one can practice diplomacy, but it's also impact on familial ties within families, within friends, professional development. So the fact that we are confined to where we are has been impactful to all of us without exception. But I think in the domain of diplomacy, in the domain of interstate communications, along the line of Dubes Gary's remark at the beginning, I think we should feel blessed that we have all this technology at the moment. I don't know, Pak Dino and our friends in FPCI, if we were to have this event in a traditional brick and mortar form, I don't think we can have as many participants as we have been informed are engaged in this process. So on the one hand, yes, there is a minus. We don't have direct personal communications, but on the other hand, there are the pluses. We can be more expansive, more extensive, more inclusive, but these are just modalities, and we need to ensure that the opportunity provided is utilized in the manner that it's intended for. I can well imagine, for instance, I'm sure it has already been done, all kind of model negotiation, model UN, model ASEAN type of thing that can be, or model Indonesia-Australia. What is it now called, Pak Gary? I'm not sure. Is it strategic partnership, comprehensive strategic partnership, or the ultimate comprehensive partnership?
A beautiful comprehensive strategic partnership.
Yes, we will add on to, but I'm sure there are many modalities that can be added on. And please call on us, how people like myself and others can help create the kind of atmospherics to the extent possible of how, for instance, a diplomatic negotiation, mediation environment can take place. But to conclude, I know the time is running out, and I wish to thank first and foremost Pak Dino and Pak Dubes Gary and all the friends at the embassy and FPCI for making possible my participation. I'm really grateful, and I'm really thankful that you have the patience to listen at length to what I had chosen to share. I do mean what I said just now, that I do feel that Indonesia-Australia bilateral relationship is one of the most important nexus or axis between in this region. And I'm confident that through programs such as this, it will become even more strengthened. We spoke at length at various times on the importance of technology. And I was just thinking just now, Pa Gary, wasn't it the case that actually, if you think about it, in the education domain, Australia was actually a path breaker in this domain, because in the old days, in the 60s, 70s, I don't know until when, you used to have those CB radio, I don't know what is the term you use, but to reach out to students, kids in the outback, so-called outbacks, to be able to access education. But nowadays, rather than through wires, we have these digital technologies. In other words, while we all pay tribute and recognize and reinforce the importance of the wonderful tools that we have just now, let's not assume that this is only a present day phenomenon. Technology is constantly changing, constantly evolving. Change is permanent, and it is our capacity to adapt to these technological changes that is most important. But thank you very much for your patience this afternoon, this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Pa Marty. Again, I'd like, on behalf of FPCI and also all of our friends here, would like to sincerely thank you for indulging us in having this dialogue and discussion. It's not every day that the young people has the chance to share their thoughts and concerns directly with the top leading minds in this field. So thank you again, sir. And again, I'd like to apologize if not all of the questions were able to be asked. Perhaps we can have a later opportunity, but thank you so much also for all the participants for being active today. I will now try to attempt to summarize some of the points that Pa Marty has made earlier. In the COVID-19 pandemic era, there has been an increased use of technology, but it has its merits and it also has its sets of concerns. It allows us to be able to connect with one another despite borders, despite geographical divides such as this one. But on the other hand, we should also caution ourselves whether the cyber space that we engage ourselves in, does it make us more informed, or has it actually overwhelmed us with more information? And in this context too, diplomacy and foreign policy has become, there's an impression that diplomacy in foreign policy has become more transactional, that the gain of one must be at another's cost, and this should not be, even though this is under the umbrella of national interest. Again, the nexus between domain and external, the domain of the domestic and external domain has become increasingly prominent here. COVID-19 pandemic has become the perfect epitome that shows how interlinked causes are between economy, climate change, public health, security, and so many others. It also highlights the fact that what happens in the local arena also matters in the national, regional, and international level. So I'd like to end this event on one important yet simple note that Pa Marty has mentioned earlier. If one fails to recall the complete substance of this lecture, then one should remember that in diplomacy, words matter. So leaving this event, I'd like to encourage all of our friends here, our young friends, to really consider yourself as a diplomat, as an ambassador of the causes that you have chosen to take in this world, or in the studies, or in whatever mission that you'd like to pursue. We are never short of problems. We are never short of problems to solve. You know, the world is so complex and it's so dynamic, and it is exactly why we have this platform, so that we can discuss and engage ourselves in this, you know, most pressing issues of our time. Again, I'd like to echo Pa Marty's call earlier that the role of the young people is very central in fighting climate change. So if this is something of your concern, or maybe if there's another issue that you're passionate about, then I'd like to encourage you to pursue that and use your words to call for action. Thank you so much again, once again, to for all the participants, for Marty, Ambassador Gary, Padino, and all of our friends who are watching from YouTube. We are very pleased to have held this event, and hopefully we can meet again at a later opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we are, no, I think our internet.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it's us. We can just leave.
Thank you, everyone.